Good evening. Welcome to the ICA. I'm Monica Garza, Director of Education. It gives me great pleasure to share this special evening with all of you as we welcome artist Kara Walker to Boston. Kara's work is recognized around the country for her investigations on race, gender, sexuality, and violence in America's short and complicated history. According to fellow artist Barbara Kruger, quote, Walker's vigilance has produced a compelling reckoning with the twisted trajectories of race in America. She is brave, and we all agree. In a moment, Kara will introduce her creative practice and then join Ava Respini, the ICA's Barbara Lee Chief Curator, on the stage. But before I hand over the mic to her, I'd like to read to you a few of her many, many accomplishments. Kara received degrees from Atlanta College of Art and the Rhode Island School of Design. Early in her career, in 1996, her work was featured at the ICA in a group exhibition titled New Histories. Here's just a shot of that installation. The following year, she was awarded a John D. and Catherine MacArthur Foundation Achievement Award. Over the years, Kara's work has been featured in numerous exhibitions around the globe. Today, her work can be found in museums and public collections, such as the Guggenheim, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Tate Gallery in London. Kara presented her first large-scale public project in 2014 in an abandoned Domino sugar refinery in Brooklyn. It was a monumental sugar-covered sphinx-like sculpture that reflected on the troubling history surrounding sugar as a commodity. In 2015, the ICA was granted the privilege of becoming stewards of one of Kara's bold works, thanks to the generosity of Bostonian Barbara Lee. I hope all of you have seen it upstairs already. Since the work was installed at the ICA in August as part of the Barbara Lee collection of art by women, it has captured many of our imaginations and reminded us that art can foster necessary dialogue, reflection, and empathy in a world that many feel is irreparable. Kara, you and your work offers me hope. Not blind faith, but the type of radical hope described by author Junot Diaz earlier this week in The New Yorker. It is a type of hope that emphasizes the importance of imagination, community, and all forms of social and political participation. It humbles me to know that this work will be seen by Bostonians for generations to come. Your work will inspire many in our city to never abandon our personal responsibility to fight and demand equality and justice for all. I thank you for creating and sharing this with us. And now, for all of you in the audience, know that the ICA, under the guidance of Jill Medvedow, is committed to championing contemporary art and artists like Kara, who amaze and inspire us and offer us a new type of hope for creating a better future. Thank you. Kara.
Good evening. Thank you for having me, Boston ICA. I don't know how to follow up that introduction except by refuting it all. I never wanted to find myself in a position where my work was that important. I say semi-facetiously. So everyone reminded me today that I'm a pro, and I've done this before, but every time I do it, it's like the first time, and every time I step into the studio, it's a little bit like starting from square one, and looking backwards seems to be what I'm attempting to do. So I thought I'd start somewhere in the middle of my practice and then go forward and backward erratically. This is still from a video called 8 Possible Beginnings, or the History of African America. And I thought I would start on this still because there's a narrative framework to all of my work. And when I started doing the cutouts and in graduate school at RISD, I did so kind of without thinking very consciously about narrative or how or where narrative sits in contemporary discourse, which was at the time nowhere. and forgive me for being like a little bit hesitant and thoughtful. I got a huge wave of cold feet coming here today because I feel like I spent a long time in Providence and came back and forth to Boston, and I realized I haven't been to Boston in at least, well, I've been to Cambridge, but I haven't been to Boston in about 10 years. So I missed all this development over here. So it's very like, I'm like not sure where I am anymore. So I'm going to get my footing. The 8 Possible Beginnings is my attempt at making a narrative that's an origin story, or at least thinking about origin stories in the sort of classic mythical sense, and thinking about origin stories that we tell ourselves to remind ourselves or to make us believe that we know where we come from. So this was an origin story sort of told in 8 parts. One section has this character, King Cotton, being sort of birthed in the New World through a kind of magical process of ingestion and excretion. And then there's a section where he gets impregnated by the slave owner or the master and gives birth to this little cotton plant that then emerges into a large cotton plant. And then there's the little tinder scenes, and the whole thing is kind of interrupted and undercut by the soundtrack from what's that Disney film about Song of the South? Thank you. See, so we all know it, but few of us have seen it. And it was done in preparation for a show that I had in 2005 at the Red Cat Gallery, which is the Roy and Edna Disney CalArts Theater Gallery. It's the second film that I made out of a series of not very many. The first one was Testimony, which is a sort of revenge fantasy. Then I went into color. I moved into a modern era in 2007 with Calling to Me from the Angry Surface of Some Gray and Threatening Sea, the title I didn't think I would need to remember today, but I decided to use. And I started to kind of focus on the videos for a while because it seemed like the logical outgrowth to the cut paper silhouette work. And the cut paper silhouette work had a couple of different functions for me in my studio. One, it sort of served as a way to served me as a way to break away from painting, or it gave me an outlet to think about what painting or traditional painting means to me, what it means coming from me, and basically, as a young woman growing up partly in California and partly in Georgia, around Atlanta, I became aware that my body was more important than my artwork. Rather, people viewed my artwork through my body. So in the best possible way, that meant for charged arguments about you're a woman, artist, and, who is this work meant to please? Is this like satisfying a patriarchal worldview? And you're an African American artist, and whose, laws, whose rules are you following? This Western view of art. And when I sat back in my studio in the attic above my parents' garage, I wasn't really sure what was important to me as a painter. I certainly took it for granted. So setting painting aside was a kind of a huge effort. I began to relate painting to other sorts of manifest destiny types of practice, like here I have a blank slate and I can do whatever I want with it. Well, says who? Liberation politics might tell me that I cannot do that, or that I should know better, or that it's not a blank slate. Anyhow, I have a lot of slides, and I wanted to just kind of like rattle through them and not talk about the content of my work, because so much has been written about it by so many different people. And I've heard artists sort of somewhat disparagingly, somewhat comically complain that everybody is writing dissertations about my work, which seems to be somewhat true. But I think part of that is because it leaves a lot of open questions. Cutting out paper has its formal, obviously there was a formal problem that I was trying to solve, but there was also a content problem that I was trying to solve, which had to do with being viewed as a Black woman and having my work always having to respond to that Blackness, and then having to understand, what does that mean? What does being a Black woman mean to y'all? Because I thought I knew who I was, or I was becoming aware of who I was as a person, as a Kara in the world. But I started to wonder what all of these other associations were that were aligned with my body. So as a project in graduate school, partly because I got away, I think the effort to sort of leave my family home, to leave Atlanta, to leave the sort of art universe that I grew up around, as my father's a painter, was important and cathartic. But I also set about the sort of task of really kind of unpacking anything that had to do with history, with my Black body, with minstrelsy, with early American artwork. I wanted to find an origin story for myself as an artist. I wanted to see what artist out there in the past, in my American past, would most resemble me. And if I couldn't find one, then I would have to invent one. So I guess at a certain point I became a negress of noteworthy talent. So I guess in that same breath of becoming the negress, I was reading some books and looking at forms of art that maybe had a second-class status in the world of fine art. And what I discovered, or what I felt an affinity for, were very small, intimate craft. Oh, am I going backwards? Sorry. Crafty works like the cut paper silhouettes, or work that might be confined to non-citizens like women or African Americans, and then work that was so full of a kind of hubris that it a kind of history painting that was larger than history painting, that wanted to encompass the whole world. So the panorama that was sort of born in the 18th and 19th centuries, that began to encompass the viewer in the sort of pre-cinematic way. I found that was kind of like the pure and maybe illogical outgrowth of a kind of patriarchal history. Like, this is what, this is beyond, it doesn't even fit in the museum anymore. You have to build your own space, and it becomes kind of hyperbolic and histrionic. And those are two forms that I still am wrestling with and working with: the cut paper silhouette and the grand history drama. But the work also comes from texts and writing and reading to some extent, although I say that and I feel like I'm making a myth about myself now, because I feel like I haven't been reading enough or writing enough. There's so much to read. There's so much to know about the past, about where we are right now. And it's sort of comforting in a way to go back to fictions, the narratives from our not-so-distant past, to glean where we might be, or where I might be, and how I might talk about, or fail to talk about it. So the piece that you have here, I'll just address briefly, is the Nigger Huck Finn, ... And all the titles are long, and all the titles are intentionally narrative and intended to draw a viewer into my universe. And it was not exactly commissioned, but I was invited to be a part of a show at the Wattis Institute at CCA in California, and the show's theme was Huckleberry Finn, which in itself is pretty limiting. If and I was a little bit resentful / playful with that idea. I thought, of course, I should be in a show about Huckleberry Finn. I love Samuel Clemens. I love everything that I've read, and and I love his playfulness and earnestness and concentration on character. And I don't really know that I need to be faithful to the text. And so I was thinking about Huckleberry Finn as this object of desire for many, many generations, the boy who has his freedom. But I also think, well, he's an abused child, and somewhere in between his experiences of abuse and escape, there's a correlation to some other characters that I'm interested in who don't get their full story. So Topsy from Uncle Tom's Cabin is my other favorite. I figured they could probably get along very well if she had been allowed to break free of Harriet Beecher Stowe's grasp. That's Harriet Beecher Stowe with the hook. And there's also a character, an object of desire in A Death in Venice, which is not related at all to Huckleberry Finn, but I happen to be interested in it. It's the artist's prerogative. And as it is also my prerogative to jump around, I occasionally get very tired of making cut paper silhouette work because it is recognizably a Kara Walker, and I wonder what else I can do. I'm not sure if I've answered that question, but my practice basically is an extension on drawing, because I felt that painting was, that my relationship to painting was kind of sidling up to Western patriarchal power in a way that was kind of queasy and maybe not working. I settled on these other forms, right? The second-class forms, the silhouette and the panorama, but text and writing have always kind of played a role. And this show was a 2007 show of drawings, which I showed at the Sycamore Jenkins Gallery, and then simultaneously at another gallery, I had a long video work. It was a very busy season, but the first volley in the gallery was there was a series of self-portraits that were taken from Wikipedia pages of other notable Black women creative forces whose Wikipedia pages are sort of rife with a kind of portrait of tragedy. I think I was just looking for a model that I could, a historical model that would satisfy. So there's sort of, she led a turbulent life with, multiple miscarriages, or her life ended on a tragic note. It's kind of the overarching theme. She became an on-screen person, became the on-screen personification of the mammy stereotype, a large matronly Black woman with a quick temper and large laugh and subservient manner. And then the bulk of the show, I was kind of, thematically, I was sort of jumping around thinking about the migration of African Americans from the South to the North. I was thinking about drawing as this sort of, transitional kind of material where it's sort of neither a painting nor a sketch. I was thinking about this sort of strange place, this space in between becoming living with a rural heart and entering into an urban center, and there's something that transforms in between. So there's texts, it's kind of loosely drawn from The New Negro by Alan Locke. this sort of imagery that is either drawn directly from images of lynchings or narrative or stories or newspaper articles about lynchings that occurred that are lost to time, small incidents in the lives of America. And all of the text pieces are sort of relief. I made letters out of cardboard, and basically it was very physical. They're sort of they're different than Glenn Ligon's in that they're sort of like very flat and stamped. So I think there are about 44 works in this show. Felt very like manic and cathartic in a way, but in the end, it's kind of left me with this weird sensation, I guess because of the unresolved nature of drawing, that they just need to transform into yet another thing. And so the other thing was this video, Fall from Grace, Miss Pippi's Blue Tail, which was over at Lehman Maupin Gallery. And it's a story that more or less concerns lynching and the mythology of pure white womanhood that was the excuse for so many lynchings in America. And so there's kind of a seduction / love story / porn story in the center of it that becomes kind of, I don't know if it becomes clear or unclear. For me, it felt very clear that there was some kind of sensitivity between puppets that results in calamity. I think that was actually the last shadow puppet video I did, and that was 2011. And no real reason except that I find it emotionally exhausting to work with puppets. And to work with other people with the puppets, because, yeah. The first time I had to talk about my work in 1997, I think, I had a very busy year that year, and I had to show it at the Renaissance Society in Chicago, then a show in San Francisco, then a group show in Minneapolis, and then I went back to San Francisco to talk about my work, and I had just created this piece, I actually showed it a little earlier, that's in the round, called Slavery, Slavery, and it has a very long title, and I was very excited about how long the title was. It was like it would just like take up a page, and half a page, and I was about to go on stage, and I called up my curator friend who had just become friends, and I said, "What's the title of that piece?" And that's kind of like for me, it's my internal running joke about every lecture that I give, because I literally never write them down, but I insist that you know what they are when you go in. And I think there's a part of me that knows, and I've heard this enough times even growing up and all along, that viewers, often gravitate towards the label on the wall. Even, and I don't know if it's because there's something more comforting or familiar about text that, we know how to read, and that maybe it'll give us a clue. But I love the instability of images as far as how, we aren't necessarily aware of how we're conditioned to respond to images, or we don't really know what our body is doing, and our brain is trying to tell us, this is what's happening, I know this is what's happening, but I'm feeling this other thing. Anyway, I say that all to preface that I don't know the title of this piece, but this was a commission of a sort for the Art Institute of Chicago, and it's kind of modeled on the piece that's here, the Huck Finn piece, and that was the second and only other time I incorporated the drawings onto the cut paper works. In this case, I had the large graphite drawings and small watercolors, and then the cut paper pieces. The story here is different for me in that it's So there's a novel out there that seems prescient right about now, and it's called The Turner Diaries. And it's a white supremacist novel that was from the 70s, I believe, that it's kind of a speculative fiction, and it is the speculative fiction origin story of the idea of a race war. And I've known about it for a long time, but I never read it, and I finally found a PDF and read it. But it took me a while. It's, you know, it's not like super well written, but it's you know, and it's also a convoluted read where it's sort of prefaced as though it is a document that has been discovered from an era prior to its writing, but it's, you know, like a man from the future is telling the reader that this was a document that was discovered in the past, or that was written in the past. About an event that we would all know about as readers. And it was the inspiration for, say, Timothy McVeigh's terror attack in Oklahoma, and it's just out there. So in a lot of my other work, well, a number of other pieces, there's a text that I assume that the viewers have a modicum of familiarity with, like Uncle Tom's Cabin or Gone with the Wind, or some kind of like, you know, Song of the South, some kind of like quaint but familiar, you know, Huckleberry Finn. But this is kind of on the obscure side, but I do, it does seem important to know about. In any case, what happened, so I'm sort of like working with an obscure text and then burrowing into my own paranoid psychology, or my own paranoid psyche, and thinking about what are the outcomes. You know, like if we're assuming that this text represents a desire for white supremacy or white rule, and that what that will entail is getting back our guns, getting rid of the blacks and the Jews, and interring them or whatever, and who's going to clean that up? So in my sort of like reworking of this paranoid text, I thought, well, I'm going to clean that up. So anyway, this to say, I don't know if it's a successful piece, but I do feel like when I was working on this, and the watercolors on this wall in particular, it was during it was election night 2012, and I wasn't sure which direction that was going to go, and I was freaking out. So this is the second time I freaked out in an election. And so these watercolors were done in my room with, a closed door, with this text nearby, with the radio on in another room, and I was sort of pulling language from the text, this kind of incendiary language from the text, and sort of extrapolating from that. And the thing about, all of this work, is that I can only, as an artist, I think I position myself as an unreliable narrator. I might be missing the point. I'm, again, like the importance of having the title as an anchor, getting into like what happens when you're working from your gut is uncontrollable. And I think that for me, thinking about this idea of making a painting as a tabula rasa or as a manifest destiny or some kind of like space where I have total mastery, it's more interesting to me to assume that while I might want to have total mastery, I have to assume that this work might do me in. That this object or this image that I draw, I don't have complete control over. That, and this was sort of my argument in my head anyway. My argument when I was starting to do the cutouts and really thinking about stereotypes and misunderstanding, as I was looking at work by other artists who had maybe reappropriated like the mammy archetype, the mammy stereotype, and then sort of maybe repurposed her as something other than subservient, which is totally legit and totally what needs to be. But I also thought, as an artist, isn't it unfair to make her do anything? Isn't it unfair to take a slave archetype and then make it do something for you? I just, so that's kind of like where I kind of situate myself, which makes it very hard for me sometimes to even start doing anything because I already am my own antagonist in this drama. 2014, this is the year I have to live down. When I got invited in 2013 by Creative Time, Nato Thompson and Ann Pasternak came to my studio, and they had asked several times if I would do a public art project, and I apparently said no several times. But they had this really interesting venue, and I had to see it, and would I come out? And yes, so I went out to the Domino sugar factory, and it was slated for demolition. It's this amazing cavernous space covered with decades, years and years of molasses and sugar, and it's really smelled really funky. And they said, we're thinking about having maybe several artists do something in here. And I was like, what do you mean several artists? I thought you were just inviting me to do something. And so hubris got the better of me, and I spent the latter part of that year freaking out again, like, what have I done? What have I done? I felt I could do something, but I also felt, a little bit hamstrung by my 2D work, and even the film video work is fairly flat. It's like flat. So the process but the process somehow is the process of panicking and working through and sketching and drawing, writing, reading. That's all important to me. It's not always as fun as just like scribbling something, but somewhere in the later stages of having to present an idea, I had been reading this book by Sidney Mintz, who was an amazing anthropologist and just passed away. And he just passed away this year. He wrote this book, Sweetness and Power. And Sweetness and Power blew my mind, because it's like the whole history of sugar refining, sugar as a substitute for honey first, sugar as the food of, the foodstuff that royalty could have access to. And then, he goes through the transatlantic slave trade and the, importance of sugar in the Industrial Revolution, for sort of keeping workers active. And so there are all these really interesting socialist connections between sugar and taste. Like the human desire for this particular flavor is kind of cultivated. I mean, we gravitate towards sweet, but the sugar sweet that we have refined is not natural, really. I mean, you can suck on a sugar cane, but it's not the same as, what you get when you granulate it. Anyway, it's a lot of little stories, but I was on the G train going home, and I wasn't sure what I was going to make, and I learned about the subtleties as there she is. A subtlety is the English term. Are you going to applaud for that? No. Don't do that. Thank you. So a subtlety is a sugar sculpture, And it was popular in the medieval era, and I mean, sugar sculptures have been around for a long time. They've mostly transformed over the years, so we don't think of sugar sculptures as much. Maybe for Day of the Dead, you get sugar skulls. At Valentine's Day, you get sugar, all kinds of sugar. Wedding cakes are very basically a version of a subtlety. You know, we've got a little sugar couple on the top. So our subtleties have shrunk over the centuries, but I love the term a subtlety, and when I read about that, I was like, oh, of course that's what I'm making. It wasn't obvious to me until I went back to the space, and then it seemed silly. What shape would what form would the subtlety have? I immediately thought of a sphinx, and you have to know, you don't have to know, but I'll tell you because we're here. I had this kind of PowerPoint sketch worked out. It wasn't really a sketch. I didn't really know how to articulate what it was I was thinking. So in order to think through, I couldn't draw because that's too familiar. And I couldn't, just like kind of sculpt something because that was too unfamiliar. So I was working on this like image timeline that went from, that talked about sugar as the commodity, a beloved commodity of the slave trade, sugar, which begets molasses, which begets rum, which begets more slaves to produce more sugar. And then sugar as one of many industrial products that have changed our environment and our bodies, and sugar as having these associative kind of poetic properties, brown sugar, and these kind of like terms of endearment that we use. And so it was all of that, but it was all kind of like like pictures from the internet. And I was like, okay, this is not the piece. So I would show it to everyone and say, this is not the piece, this is just the ideas, right? This is the ideas. We've got industry, and we've got destruction of our bodies, and destruction of ways of life, and destruction of other people's bodies and cultures. But this is what I'm gonna make, and it's a sphinx. and why a sphinx? Because it's a public art project, and that's the other big problem, in a way, in this sort of heady situation I was in. It's like, how do you talk about all that stuff without it being a huge downer? Like without it looking like I'm just like finger wagging, saying, you bad, stupid humans, and your bad ideas. Look what hell we have wrought, because nobody would listen to that, really. Like, we'd hear it, but then we'd be like, yeah, whatever, shut up. So I would. So, but for public art is, you're talking to a bigger audience, you already know that, but, you're not just assuming that when people walk into a museum or gallery, they assume a different behavior than when they're outside or, in a non-museum space. It's a little bit uncertain terrain, and I wanted to find an iconic, like a one single iconic thing, because really I was like, what works in my work is that I kind of boil everything down to like this shape that's a black piece of paper on a wall that is also a shape of something that is recognizable and that is happening. So what could be boiled down, and what do people gravitate towards? Big objects that are in ruins. And also, I was thinking about all of this, and I thought, oh, Sphinx would be funny. And then I thought, but the Sphinx would be kind of silly. And then I was walking home, and there was a giant bus turning that was like very close to me. I won't say that it almost hit me, but it was very close to me, and it had Sphinx written on the side. And I was like, it doesn't always happen like that, but sometimes you wish that it would. You're just like, it's like, okay, done. And so when that sort of got the ball rolling, and I had also been thinking about, like, how do you do sculpture? What is sculpture? What does sculpture mean for me? And what does sculpture mean for us, like as a kind of like baseline American culture? Like there's grand sculpture, and then there's the stuff that I'm kind of interested in, which is a little bit less than grand. And so I was looking at a lot of images online, sort of like gifts, things that people put on their shelves, candy dishes, and discovered these little characters. They're about that high, little resin servant boys. I think they had some other kind of, Amazon.com title around them, like African young basket keyword search. And the idea was to cast these in sugar and arrange them like attendants to the queen, either offering or building her or taking something, or stand-ins for the viewer. And what I discovered in making sculpture is that making giant candy sculptures is hard because they fall apart immediately. So I started with the idea of 15. In the end, I wound up with 4 solid candy, and the remainder were resin coated with molasses and sugar. And some of them are carrying the body parts of the fallen candy boys. It was really the most tragic thing that happened, was that I would finish pouring this heated sugar concoction, get it to the right temperature, unmold it, and then watch it the first one was gone in a day, the second one took a little longer, and then, anyway, trial and error. It was a relatively fast-moving project. It was the whole piece was completed in 8 weeks, and it was on view for 8 weekends. And the idea that I had all along was that it would be destroyed at the end. And I preserved the left hand. The basic structure of the sphinx was recyclable, and the boys that were made out of sugar deteriorated during the course of the exhibition. And then for my second grandiose act after that, I was invited to participate in an off-site Venice Biennale project at the Teatro La Fenice, which is the Grand Opera House in Venice. And I was invited. They had really just recently instituted this collaboration between Biennale artists and the opera to design sets and costumes. But sets and costumes for a set opera that was already on the calendar. So I didn't have my choice, which is fine because I don't know anything about opera or theater or Italian. So, the overall project was a good reminder that sometimes working with Creative Time and all of the volunteers and sculptors and the tech people, everybody was so amazing, and everybody was really pulling together, and it's really amazing to be with an organization whose goal it is to realize your project. They really didn't get in the way, and it's very different. It was a somewhat different experience in Italy. It was very not, I won't say combative, but there were moments, and then there, working in an unfamiliar language across the board. So I'm happy with the image, and I'm happy with, that people were happy with the opera. The opera itself is Norma, which is the story of a high priestess of the Druids, who's got a couple of children and a secret love affair with their occupiers, who were the Romans. So I kind of switched up the location, but it's kind of still an imaginary location using some Aaron Douglas-like, Carol Walker-like Africa motifs, masks. So here it is. So this large mask-like shape that everybody sort of moves around is kind of like the god. I think in other productions it's represented as a tree or something along those lines. And then the occupiers are kind of modeled on, I'm forgetting his name, De Brazza, who was, kind of like the gentle colonizer of the Congo. So more recently, some cut paper silhouette work, and then we'll end it. This is just from a gallery show in London that I went back to Stone Mountain, which is a town my family and I moved to when I was, we moved to Atlanta when I was 13 and Stone Mountain when I was 15. And there's a large Confederate carving on the side of this mountain that, I probably could credit with giving me some ideas about figures in profile on a grand scale. And then the cut paper piece is a comment on that. And my goal for this show basically was to inquire if the High Museum in Atlanta would buy my work. And this was an initial sketch called 40 Acres of Mules. And right now, up in Cleveland, I have a show of drawings, and the show will be coming to New York in May, I believe, or at least some parts of the show, and I'm going to add some other work. But I was in Rome at the American Academy of Rome earlier this year, and did some work thinking about building walls, thinking about Christianity's influence on African bodies over generations. Rome will do that, apparently. I'm thinking about monuments and longevity and isolation and abstraction to some extent. This is a strange drawing that came out of a feeling of distress called The Passion of Every Wretched and Ungrateful Meme You Post. And this is origin story. And there's an essay that I wrote that's in the catalog for this show that kind of tries to bridge some thoughts that I have about Black Lives Matter, or Black Lives Mattering, and monuments, and longevity, and carrying your dead, and I guess holy relics. So that's it for now.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Kara. That was wonderful to see the very quick survey, really, of your work to date, and to see so many great images, and to hear about the process and what it takes to make the work. So thank you for sharing that with us. And it's so great to see so many people in the audience. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I thought maybe we would go back to the work that's in our collection, that's on view upstairs, that I hope all of you have had a chance to spend some time with. I like one of the things that you said about being an unreliable narrator, that as an artist, you're not a historian, you're not an anthropologist, that you can take liberties. And clearly, fiction writing has been such a central part of your practice and where you've taken inspiration from. And here you have a work that's a response to Huckleberry Finn, seminal novel, one that most of us has read. And yet it's not a literal translation, but sort of moving beyond and inhabiting your own world and your own language. I'm currently rereading the novel. I don't think I've read it since high school, and I'm actually quite surprised by the violence that's in the book. And your works, including this piece that's upstairs, often includes a combination of imagery that's shocking, angry, violent, sometimes comically grotesque. And certainly, we don't just see that in the Huck Finn piece, and you were a little bit hesitant to talk about content today, but I wonder if you can comment on this mix in your work, the push and pull between different narratives.
I can try. Well, I'm going to elliptically get around to it because I was thinking it's sort of a response to Huckleberry Finn, the novel, but also a response to the curatorial conceit of being invited to a show about Huckleberry Finn, the novel. Which, you know, I think in some respects some of the violence of the work is sort of an outgrowth of my own sort of like reactionary anger at the sort of trap that I've put myself in, or that I put myself and by extension the figures in my work in. There is, you know, because I think there's actual violence and then there's depictions of violence, and they're very different things. One leaves you intact as a viewer. I sometimes, and I don't mean to be too evasive, but there are sometimes, comically grotesque is maybe where I gravitate, although I do now sort of recognize there's a body that's sort of chopped up and a boy holding an axe, so maybe that is not comic and just grotesque. But I think that, I guess there's sort of questions about, you know, what's the logical extension to one's freedom, like, you know, as far as like escaping from either an abusive situation or a tyrannical father or a tyrannical situation. What are the extents that these figures will go to either escape the figure before it, or the figure next to it, or the figure who's making it, meaning myself, or the figure who's viewing it. I think sometimes, you know, for instance, I usually don't identify, but I did think of, you know, Harriet Beecher Stowe not wanting her Topsy character to get too intimate with Huckleberry Finn, would be, you know, logical.
When we installed the work this summer, we installed it just after the shootings in Baton Rouge. And with the events of the election last week, we are living in a divided nation more than ever. And your work has this incredible capacity to talk about the present, but through the lens of the past, in my opinion. And we're talking about a work, you know, that's not that old. It's from 2010. But how have recent events made you see your work in a different light, or have they?
Well, no, actually, that's the problem. Yeah. I think we've been living in a divided nation, really. I think that it's not. It's, you know, I just I had an argument with my sister, and it was a little too personal, but I wrote her a letter after the argument, and I didn't know what I was going to say because I didn't really feel sorry, but I just felt like, and I said, you know, there are two sort of, you know, origin stories in my sort of development and my understanding of duplicity, and one is, you know, closer to home, and then one is just, you know, my experiences in high school and living in Georgia and in college, and this kind of latent old school racism that, you know, I mean, it has just been here. I don't know how many different ways people have asked me to wish it away for them. And I think doing the cut paper silhouette was one way of wishing it away, by making it fanciful and easily digestible. But I feel like the thing that I've done, which as artists we often say, well, how am I responding to this? Am I doing anything? If I'm not doing anything proactively right now because I'm in shock, am I doing anything in my studio practice? And the one thing that I found myself doing is going completely backwards. Like, okay, there was something in 1991, 92 that is still present in here, and it just came right back up. I think that if anything, well, I don't have an if anything, not yet.
Well, it's something that I think about as a curator, that I believe it's hard enough to make the work, that an artist doesn't necessarily have to talk eloquently about their work. They don't necessarily have to talk at all about their work. And in a way, that's our job as curators, to be interlocutors, and that's what we hope museums can do. Can you talk about a little bit more, sort of teasing this out, how you see your role as an artist or as a spokesperson?
Spokesperson? I already used the unreliable narrator part, so now I can't be unreliable because I do know my practice a little bit. It's tricky. I think that I always kind of I initially rejected the spokesperson idea before I had a career. Like I said, well, I'm not going to be like a spokesmodel for Black women everywhere, but I do want to make work that will speak to a woman like myself somewhere in the, I want that I to be the first one, the one who might know better what, might have read their history book better than I did. I want that. I want our dialogue to kind of assume a body of knowledge that comes from, experiences of being a woman, being African American, and being, cognizant of how this country works. It's not necessarily that it's an American art, but I don't mind sort of entrapping myself in that place, because I really was thinking about America as my origin point, But I didn't answer your question, so I don't know about being a spokesperson, though.
One thing that I love about this piece, and an aspect of your practice that I love, is your drawings. And this piece, like the Chicago piece that you talked about, has a combination of works on paper with the cut paper silhouettes. Can you talk a little bit more about your drawing practice and how it relates to the practice as a whole?
Yeah, I think, well, it's all kind of a piece. The drawing, I started drawing or doing watercolors specifically as a kind of, it felt very throwback in the early 90s to do little drawings and watercolors. It was, I think, there are a few other people that, Nicole Eisenman had some drawings, and Sue Williams, and I remember being like, oh God, thank God, there's some other people doing this kind of, because there was a lot of grandiose painting, big corporate art, and stuff that was just kind of, that was real. And but I think that doing this work, it's intimate, and it gave me an opportunity to really kind of flesh out what I didn't know I was thinking about, because I think if I lived a somewhat sheltered and very shy life, and I'm much less shy now, but I was very, very shy when I started doing this work. And being able to sort of write it out and draw it out was sort of fiercely liberating, and so I decided that should always be a model for me to return to, so that I don't always think that I'm making a big piece. I don't think of it as a big piece. I think of it as a kind of finalizing, not finalized, as kind of extending, the large work sort of extends what's happening in the small work. But I usually kept them separate up until this piece. I do a bunch of watercolors, and then, kind of treat them like sketches. And this one, I really felt like they were something other than sketches. They were, I don't know, thoughts that were concurrent with the cutouts.
One thing that struck me as you were showing your slides is the continual invention and inspiration that you have found in the cut paper pieces and the silhouettes, and that even applies to the moving image works, the shadow plays, these kind of proto-cinematic works. And you didn't talk too much about the video or moving image practice. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Well, it took me a while to do it. It seemed like, again, it was like a natural extension to doing the cutout pieces, but I have, and it's not that I'm, well, I just have a drawing, painting, printmaking background, and so I didn't feel very confident, sort of like, I mean, it's not that I didn't feel confident, I really didn't trust the mechanics of the machine. Like to turn on I had a Super 8 camera, and I was like, I don't know what's happening in there, you know? like, is it doing anything? Like, I need results. So, so before I even made a film, I was doing these sort of light projection pieces. There was kind of like, there was the shadow box things that were at the ICA and the other location, but then there were, just other ways of experimenting with light, with overhead projectors and gels and things like that. Just because I felt like I needed to sort of see it physically happen before I trusted the machine. And so the first piece I did wasn't until, I think, 2004, a Super 8 film called Testimony, and it was just completely silent. There's no ambient noise or anything, which is very unsettling. I was told by a filmmaker that you should never do that, but if I had a film background, I might have known that. But in any case, it was, it's very choppy and hokey, and it's a fairly simple narrative of a kind of reversal of fortune. Revenge fantasy with a little bit of stop motion animation. And then the second one was the 8 Possible Beginnings, which is a little more sophisticated, and I had some help. I really do kind of enjoy the kind of hokey nature of it. I think that I always pull back a little bit when I feel like I'm becoming too much of a puppeteer, because it actually is extremely satisfying. But at the same time, I think I'd rather there be a tension so that the work, sort of doesn't fall into the romantic, like Lotte Reiniger made beautiful shadow puppet films. Prince Ahmed is a famous one. It's like, really, that's the first full feature-length animation, and it predates Snow White. It's like she's like a master of the form, but it's really romantic. Like it's really, well-crafted. And there's something in mine, and the last one in particular, with this lynching at the end, where I just want there to be a tension between the real physical object of the cut paper object that's moving and the manipulator, which is, me or my, companions. I think it should become really aware that this is a problematic dynamic between a submissive body and a perpetrator.
One of the sort of favorite projects that you've done is a show that you organized at the Met after the deluge, which was a show that had your own work, but then you organized choosing works from the Met's amazing, incredible collection. And it happened, or it was presented after Katrina. Can you talk a little bit about the process of putting that together and the process of drawing from that very rich collection?
Yeah, that was actually kind of amazing and fortuitous, because I had been offered the gallery space probably a year prior to that show, maybe even longer. Gary Tintereau, who's the curator at the time of 19th century painting and modern, I'm not sure, he had a very long title also at the museum, but he wanted me to show my work. And I thought that just didn't quite jibe with me. And, in the period of time that I was living in New York, or had begun living in New York, 9/11 happened, and, it was just like a series of catastrophes. And, when we were watching Katrina unfold, again, that question, like, the kind of why me artist question, like, what do we do as artists, and how do we go on making this thing that we do? And I realized that I had a venue already, which was this space at the Met, and and I was really thinking about how do you hold on to the kind of feeling that was present in the initial days of this catastrophe as it was unfolding, and as we were becoming aware that nothing was being done and that people were suffering, and that there was kind of a break in the normal narrative of the normal news day, like something really tangible and felt was happening, and it was very scary. And I wanted to not lose that, I think. Because I knew, as it always happens, the narrative begins to shift. And so for that show at the Met, I said, I know you want to have a show of my work, but I'll put some of my work in, but I want to relate it back to these other points of origin that are related to this site, then this event, which is this crazy confluence of black bodies, water, and catastrophe. And, sort of locating, and so the show's kind of rumination, I guess, on the Middle Passage and on the flood, the idea of the flood or the Great Flood. And as it occurs, it's a repeated motif in world art, and cities and urban centers, and using work from all over the collection, from 19th century painting, from the African figures, and amazing Homer painting. The Gulf Stream was in there, which I was so happy to have near my own work. Obscure paintings and really important paintings, and small silhouettes, just to kind of tie it together image-wise and thematically with the whole thing. I think the idea was to have a very fluid kind of dialogue between these ideas. Yeah.
We're almost out of time, so I'll maybe wrap up with one final question, and maybe pivoting to the Domino Sugar Factory project, just because it was so monumental, so successful, and just, for those of you maybe who didn't get a chance to see it, just so physical. The smell, you commented on the smell, was really palpable. The social media response around that piece was pretty unbelievable and incredible. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, there was a lot of encouragement from the organizers to do social media. So, there was like signs leading up into the space, like with the hashtag and all of that. So I think that was inevitable. And somebody asked me about it the other day. They were really appalled at the social media response, and I wasn't really, but only because I said, this is what you get with public. That's the public in public art. I was in, any place. I said, basically, any place that you go. It was in Rome most recently, but, if there are sculptures with boobies, they will be manhandled by tourists. If there are sculptures with penises, they will be manhandled by tourists. It is like, or by, vandals. Either way, it's this kind of the same thing. I think there's some kind of impulse that is uncontrollable in the sort of human language, the human body, that not, and the truth of it is that, that is part of the social response to bodies, but it's not the whole of it. And I think that that there was a sort of a counter response to sort of like reclaim the body of this figure that, from, sort of, well, for lack of a better word, vandals who want to, pose themselves in different ways with it. That is a part of the dialogue just as much. And that on the last day of the show, these amazing women in basically dressed in white church clothes came out to the show and, were in full support, and they were appalled and shocked and happy, and like the whole range of emotions was allowed to be there, and I think that was really gratifying to see. Overall, I'm still amazed at the sort of the overall response to the piece. I mean, the numbers of people who came, the numbers of fancy celebrities I met. Do you want to know who? Because I don't think it's going to happen again. I met Alicia Keys. I met Judith Jameson. I met Beyonce and Jay-Z. I thought I'd save them for last. I did not get President Obama there, but that's fine. But it was amazing. The kind of I think 130,000 people viewed that piece in 8 weekends. Yeah.
Well, it's a testament.
I mean, that's what I meant about
vision.
2014 is the season to live down, because, like, I know what I can do, but it's not going to happen every year.
Yeah.
I don't think. It
Yeah.
could, but I don't want to be that artist.
Yeah.
Things have to be special, and things have to be needed.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe on that note, one final question. What's next for you? What are you working on? Or what are you most excited about?
Oh, I'm just terrified about everything, actually. I'm not excited, but that's sort of the rule for me. I have some projects, and like I don't like to talk about things before they're fully, but I have venues that I have to put work in. So I have a show there's a show in a slaughterhouse in Greece, and I have work for Prospect New Orleans. I think I can say that. And a couple of museums down the road, but that's a little bit down the road.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, boy.
Oh, Kara, thank you so much for sharing tonight. Thank you to all of you.